K9 dog climbed onto the police officer's coffin. What happened next left everyone in shock. Detective Ethan Carter squinted through the mist that clung to the trees like ghostly fingers, his breath rising in clouds that dissolved into the chill Adirondack air. The call had come at dawn. Another livestock attack. For weeks now, farmers on the outskirts of Briarwood had found carcasses savaged in ways that didn't fit the usual patterns. Coyotes. Maybe a rogue bear, they said. But Ethan had seen enough violence, human and otherwise, to know something else was at work here. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed on the ears and prickled the skin. Even the crows, dark dots against a leaden sky, watched in eerie silence. Ethan knelt by the remains of a goat, the body half buried beneath leaves. Deep gashes crossed its flank, but the kill was precise, deliberate. As he examined the ground, his fingers brushed tracks, too large for a coyote, too clean for a bear. Shadowy movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, but he hesitated. The figure staggered forward, limping. A German shepherd, its coat matted and dark with blood, one leg dragging uselessly. The dog's eyes, sharp and amber despite the pain, locked onto Ethan's with a feral intensity. Ethan's breath hitched. The scars across the animal's muzzle and the faded leather of a military collar told him everything. This was no stray, but a K9, left for dead in these woods. He moved slowly, one hand raised. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice low and steady. The dog's lips peeled back in a snarl, teeth bared in a warning that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. But beneath the aggression, Ethan saw something else. Exhaustion, desperation, a flicker of recognition. "You're not alone out here," Ethan said softly, easing closer, inch by inch. Shadow's growl deepened, but his body sagged, tremors rippling beneath the mud-streaked fur. Ethan sank to one knee, extending a gloved hand. The dog's gaze flickered, confusion dulling the ferocity for a heartbeat. Long enough. In one swift motion, Ethan shrugged off his jacket and draped it over the dog's shoulders. Shadow froze, muscles tight, but when Ethan didn't press, didn't force, the tension bled out of him. The snarl died to a low rumble, then silence. Night closed in faster than Ethan expected. With no safe way to carry the injured dog back to town through miles of rough terrain, he made camp, building a small fire in a hollow shielded by pine. Shadow watched every move, amber eyes glowing with each flicker of flame, but made no attempt to attack or flee. Ethan worked by the firelight, cleaning the wound in Shadow's leg with bottled water and strips torn from his own shirt. Each touch earned a warning growl, but the dog didn't bite. When Ethan eased a painkiller into a strip of beef jerky and offered it, Shadow hesitated only a moment before swallowing it whole. "You're a fighter," Ethan muttered, his voice carrying in the dark. "Just hold on, okay?" Sleep came fitfully, full of half-formed dreams of running through dark woods, of eyes watching from the shadows, of claws and snarls and crimson on snow. But when Ethan jolted awake, the fire was low, and Shadow lay against his leg, breath shallow but warm. In the distance, wolves howled, their calls threading through the trees like whispers. Shadow's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan let out a slow breath, pressing a hand to the dog's side, feeling the heartbeat flutter beneath his palm. Relief, fierce and unexpected, knotted in his throat. Morning light sifted cold and gray through the pines when Ethan broke camp, cradling Shadow against his chest despite the protest of sore arms and bruised ribs. The dog's weight was solid, grounding, and the rhythmic thud of his heartbeat was a tether in the silence. The trail back to town was narrow and winding, a scar through the underbrush. Every few yards, Ethan paused, listening, but the woods remained still, too still. A rustling broke the quiet, and Ethan's breath hitched, fingers twitching towards his gun. But it was only a deer, sleek and silent, eyes wide and dark. It watched them for a heartbeat, then vanished between the trees. As they moved on, Ethan's senses prickled, the hair at his nape rising without reason. He glanced back more than once, sure of eyes in the shadows, of movement just beyond the edge of sight. Twice he paused, certain he'd heard voices, low and whispering, words he couldn't catch. But when he turned, there was nothing. only the wind. By the time the cabins at the outskirts of Briarwood came into view, Ethan's arms trembled with the effort of carrying Shadow. Blood had seeped through the makeshift bandages, staining his sleeve. Yet even as darkness tugged at the edges of his vision, Ethan didn't stop, didn't falter, until he reached the door of the small clinic. As the vet took Shadow from his arms, Ethan stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. His breath came harsh and ragged, but relief washed over him, cold and overwhelming. Shadow's eyes stayed fixed on him even as the door swung shut, pupils dark and blown. "You're safe now," Ethan muttered, voice rough. But as he turned away, the whispering returned, a chill slithering down his spine. Not words, not really. More like a warning, threaded through the rustle of leaves and the sigh of wind. Ethan glanced back at the woods, at the shadows pooling beneath the trees, and shivered. He'd thought the worst was over. He was wrong. The wind cut sharper now, slipping cold fingers beneath Ethan's collar as he stood outside the clinic, eyes fixed on the forest's edge. He had intended to leave as soon as Shadow was seen to, but his legs felt rooted, an ache deep in his bones that hadn't been there before. The whispers had faded with daylight, but the memory of them clung like frost, refusing to thaw. Ethan rubbed a gloved hand over his face, grimacing at the sting in his knuckles, raw from the rough trek. It wasn't just exhaustion. Something else clawed at the edges of his thoughts, a weight he couldn't shake. The clinic door creaked open, spilling warmth and light onto the porch. Dr. Hayes, gray-haired and brisk, stepped out, her expression guarded. "He's stable, but the leg's a mess," she said, folding her arms. "Bullet wound. Lucky it didn't shatter the bone." Ethan's jaw tightened. Bullet wounds meant hunters or worse. "He's military," he replied, voice low. "K9 unit, from the collar." "But how the hell did he end up alone out there?" Dr. Hayes shook her head, concern deepening the lines around her eyes. "That's a question for animal control, or the Army, if they still care. Right now, he needs rest." Her eyes narrowed, studying him with the precision of a scalpel. "You don't look much better, Detective." Ethan grunted, though the truth stung. Sleep had been scarce since the call started, dreams splintered by half-heard whispers and the feeling of eyes in the dark. He muttered something about being fine, but Dr. Hayes snorted. "Bull," she retorted. "Go home, Carter. Shadow will make it through the night." The name slipped out before he could stop it. Shadow, dark and fierce, fitting the dog who'd bared his teeth even as he bled. Ethan hesitated, a protest on his tongue, but the words tangled, pulled back by a yawn that left him unsteady. In the end, he relented, letting the warm lights of the clinic fade behind him as he trudged down the path towards his truck. The drive back to his cabin wound through stretches of pines, the road a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the gloom. Ethan kept one hand loose on the wheel, the other pressed to his temple, willing the headache back. Shadows seemed to flinch at the headlights' glare, branches clawing at the sky. Twice he caught himself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to find amber eyes glaring back. By the time he reached the cabin, dusk had thickened to a deep, bruised blue. The silence was absolute, broken only by the groan of the porch steps as Ethan shouldered open the door. He hesitated on the threshold, boots grinding grit into the welcome mat. Something felt wrong. No, not wrong. Different. The air buzzed, sharp and alive, like static before a storm. Ethan flicked on the lights and froze. The living room was untouched, everything in its place, but the temperature had dropped. His breath plumed faintly in the dim light. Adrenaline spiked, clearing the fog from his thoughts. Gun in hand, Ethan moved room to room, sweeping corners and closets, every instinct screaming threat. But nothing stirred. No prints in the mud outside, no windows forced, just the cold, biting and unnatural. He holstered the gun, but didn't relax, jaw tight as he raked a hand through damp hair. It was as he passed the mirror in the hallway that he saw them, his eyes catching the light, glowing faint and gold. Ethan swore, stumbling back, heart hammering against his ribs. But when he looked again, they were just eyes, tired and bloodshot. His reflection glared back, shadows smudged beneath gaunt cheekbones. Stress, he told himself. lack of sleep, hallucinations. But the lie tasted bitter. Too many things weren't adding up. The whispers, the tracks too large for wolves, the sudden silence in the woods. And Shadow, alone and wounded, miles from any outpost. Ethan moved to the kitchen, yanking open the fridge more for the familiarity of motion than hunger. He poured a glass of water with hands that didn't quite stop shaking, downed it in gulps that left his throat raw. The first flash came as he braced against the sink, eyes shut, willing the room to stop spinning. A forest, older and darker, shadows too deep to see through. Figures cloaked in furs, eyes gleaming gold. A howl, raw and aching, threaded with human grief. Ethan gasped, lurching upright, the vision dissolving into the cabin. The vision dissolving into the cabin walls and the steady tick of the clock. He gripped the counter, head bowed, breath hitching. Not just exhaustion, not stress. Something else had slithered in, coiling tight beneath his skin, ancient and cold and watchful. When the shaking subsided, he scrubbed a hand over his face and staggered to the couch, collapsing into the worn cushions. He meant to stay awake, to piece together the splintered memories and gut feelings into something that made sense. But the fire's warmth and the weight of his own eyelids dragged him under. The dream came swift and brutal, running through trees so dark they seemed to swallow light. Blood in the air, thick and coppery, a howl fractured by agony, then silence. In the clearing, a wolf lay motionless, eyes dimming. Ethan moved forward, boots sinking into mud, but stopped short as the wolf's eyes snapped open. Gold, too human, full of accusation. "You're too late," a voice rasped, not from the wolf but from the shadows, threading through the trees. Cold flooded Ethan's veins, the weight of eyes pressing in. "Who's there?" he snarled, turning, but the shadows only deepened, pulling him down. Down. He woke with a strangled gasp, the couch a tangle of blankets and cold sweat. The fire had died to embers, casting the room in bruised red light. Ethan buried his face in his hands, trying to steady his breath, but the scent of pine and blood lingered, too vivid for a dream. He swallowed hard, forcing himself upright, limbs aching with fatigue. The vision had felt real, more memory than nightmare. But that was impossible. He'd never seen eyes like that, never stood in a clearing where the air reeked of blood and sorrow. Yet the ache in his chest, the way his hands trembled, said otherwise. Ethan staggered to the window, throwing it open to gulp in air that burned his lungs. The woods loomed dark and watchful, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw eyes glinting from the tree line. Gold, unblinking. But when he blinked, they were gone, leaving only darkness. A chill traced his spine, settling deep. Something had changed, twisted the threads of his life into a pattern he couldn't yet see. And the shadows weren't done with him, not by a long shot. Ethan woke to sunlight slicing through the curtains, too bright and sharp for the ache behind his eyes. His head throbbed in time with his pulse, and for a moment he lay motionless on the couch, blinking at the ceiling, piecing together memory from nightmare. The scent of pine and blood still clung to his clothes, too real to dismiss as a dream. He groaned, pushing upright, and scrubbed a hand over his face, wincing as bruises from the trek through the woods flared to life. The clock on the wall read past 10. Later than he'd meant to sleep. Cursing under his breath, Ethan staggered to the kitchen, downing aspirin with water cold enough to make his teeth ache. Each swallow tasted of copper and pine, and he nearly retched the memory of the clearing, the wolf's eyes gold and accusing, surging hot and bitter in his throat. He gripped the sink until the nausea passed, knuckles white, breath shuddering out in clouds despite the warmth. Outside, the woods loomed dark and impenetrable, shadows pooling beneath the pines. Ethan's fingers twitched toward the phone, half-formed plans to call it in. Something, anything to explain away the tracks too large for wolves, the whispers threading through wind. But what could he say? That he was seeing things, hearing voices on the breeze? He bit down hard, jaw aching, and grabbed his jacket instead. Focus, one thing at a time. Shadow first. The truck's engine stuttered before roaring to life, exhaust pluming white in the cold. Gravel crunched under the tires, a steady rhythm that did little to ease the coil of tension in Ethan's gut. The clinic lay half a mile down the main road, its red brick facade stark against the snow-heavy sky. Ethan barely killed the engine before he was out, boots crunching over frost as he shoved through the door, the bells jingle too bright, too cheery. Dr. Hayes looked up from the reception desk, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You look worse than your friend," she remarked dryly, but her expression softened at the tension in his stance. "He's stable, sedated for now, but you can see him." Relief punched the breath from Ethan's lungs, leaving him lightheaded and unsteady. He nodded, words tangled and useless, and followed her down the corridor to a room that reeked of antiseptic and wet fur. Shadow lay motionless on a padded table, leg bandaged, chest rising and falling in shallow beats. The sight of the dog, fierce even in sleep, ears twitching at phantom sounds, eased something raw and aching in Ethan's chest. He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping a hand to Shadow's side, careful of the wound. "Hey, boy," he muttered, voice rasping. "You gave me a scare." Shadow stirred faintly, eyes flickering beneath closed lids, a growl thrumming low and instinctive. The sound vibrated up Ethan's arm, bone deep and familiar. Not aggression, warning. Ethan's breath caught, gaze darting to the window, half expecting to find eyes watching from the tree line. But there was only snow heaped in drifts, wind pressing fingers against glass. Too quiet, too still. Dr. Hayes cleared her throat, drawing him back with a lift of her brow. "I'll leave you 2 alone," she said, tone light, but eyes wary. Ethan nodded, barely hearing her over the rush of blood in his ears. The door clicked shut, but the silence didn't ease, pressing thick and heavy, threaded with that same electric chill. Ethan dragged a stool closer, one hand absently smoothing fur matted with dried blood. Shadow's eyes slid open, amber and sharp, tracking his every move despite the sedatives. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan muttered, a wry smile twitching. But the smile died quick, nerves fraying raw. "You were running from something, weren't you?" Shadow huffed, a breathy sound almost like agreement. Ethan exhaled slow, scrubbing a hand over his face. None of it made sense. The tracks too large for any known predator. The whispers that clung even now, curling in the corners of the room. And the eyes in the dream, gold and glinting, accusing and familiar. Ethan's fingers stilled, dread clawing cold and insidious. Not just wolves, something worse. Something smart enough to drive a trained K9 into the woods, bleeding and half-mad with terror. The door creaked open before he could spiral further, and Claire slipped in, snow dusting the shoulders of her jacket, hair windblown and cheeks pink. Ethan straightened, throat tight, guilt pricking hot at the edges. She arched a brow, gaze flicking from him to Shadow and back. "Heard you found trouble," she said dryly, but her smile softened the jab. "Figured you might need backup." Relief flickered, bright and unexpected, and Ethan huffed a laugh, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "Backup's an understatement," he muttered. Claire snorted, nudging the door shut with a booted heel, eyes softening as they lingered on Shadow. "He's lucky you found him," she murmured, voice low. Ethan's jaw tightened, words catching. "Not luck," he bit out. "Someone wanted him dead." Claire's eyes snapped to his, frown carving deep. "You think it's poachers?" she asked, tone cautious. "The livestock attacks—" "Not wolves," Ethan interrupted, too sharp, too certain. Claire blinked, surprise flickering, but Ethan was already moving, dragging a crumpled map from his jacket pocket, spreading it over the counter. Red circles marked the attacks, a scattershot pattern that tightened into a line leading deeper into the woods, towards the mountains. Claire's gaze narrowed, fingers tracing the route, mouth thinning. "That's reserve land," she muttered. "Off limits for hunting." Ethan's lips pulled taut. "Hasn't stopped them before?" Claire swore under her breath, hands settling on her hips. "If they're armed—" "They're more than armed," Ethan snapped, the words slipping jagged and raw. "They're organized." His hands trembled, nails biting into palms, pulse a drumbeat at his temples. Claire's eyes narrowed, concern darkening her gaze. "Hey," she said, tone gentler. "We'll figure it out. Just slow down, okay?" Ethan's jaw ached from clenching, but he forced a breath, forced the edges of panic to dull. Claire squeezed his shoulder, a warm weight, grounding and steady. "We'll start with the attacks," she said firmly. "Tracks, cameras, anything that points to poachers." Ethan hesitated, guilt needling deep. But the memory of those eyes, gold and furious, wild and familiar, stilled the protest. He nodded, throat tight. Claire's smile was faint but fierce, something like pride sparking in her eyes. "Good," she muttered. "I'll grab my gear." The door swung shut behind her, leaving Ethan alone with Shadow in the silence and the shadows pressing close. He sank back into the stool, one hand dropping to the dog's side, grounding himself in the steady thump of Shadow's heart. Outside, the wind howled, slipping through the cracks, cold and sharp and whispering with voices that didn't fade. Ethan's eyes drifted shut, jaw tight, breaths shallow. The weight of eyes pressed down, threading through the wind. Somewhere deep and dark and wild, something was watching and waiting. The wind cut sharp through the pines, carrying snow and icy gusts that bit through Ethan's jacket as he crouched, fingers brushing tracks half buried beneath fresh powder. The prints were too large for wolves, too deep for deer, clawed and deliberate, weaving through the underbrush in a path that veered off the marked trail and towards the mountains. Ethan's pulse quickened, breath misting in the cold, eyes narrowing as he traced the path. No blood, no signs of a kill, but something else lingered beneath the sharp bite of pine and frost. Copper and musk, faint but unmistakable. His fingers twitched, instinct urging him to draw the sidearm holstered at his hip, but he held back, forcing his breathing slow. Shadow padded silent at his side, hackles raised and ears flat, amber eyes fixed on the trees. Despite the bandages and the limp, the dog moved with lethal precision, nose to the ground, every muscle tense beneath matted fur. Watching him, Ethan's chest tightened, both at the sight of the wounds and the way Shadow's head snapped up every few steps, eyes dark and wild, as if tracking something unseen. The air buzzed with tension, too quiet, too heavy, the kind of silence that set teeth on edge. Ethan's grip on the map tightened, paper crinkling beneath gloved fingers, and he straightened, gaze flicking to Claire, where she knelt a few yards back. Camera raised to snap shots of the prints. Snow clung to the edges of her beanie, her breath curling in clouds, but her hands moved steady, eyes sharp behind the lenses. "Same as the last sight," she murmured, not looking up. "No signs of wolves, no fur, no scat. If they're trying to pin this on wildlife, they're not even trying hard." Ethan grunted, a muscle ticking in his jaw, boots crunching over frost as he prowled forward, scanning the shadows threading through pines. "Poachers, then," he bit out, voice low. Claire's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue, eyes darkening with something that edged too close to fear. "Organize," she muttered. "Too clean for amateurs." Shadow growled, a low rumble that sent shivers down Ethan's spine, and both their heads snapped up, breath catching in tandem. Snow fell in hushes, muffling the world, but beneath it, something moved, branches creaking under weight too deliberate for wind. Ethan's fingers found the grip of his gun, muscle memory kicking in as he scanned the tree line, pulse a drumbeat in his ears. Claire froze, one hand resting light on Shadow's back. Eyes wide. The growl deepened, rising to a snarl that bared teeth too sharp, too white against dark fur, and Ethan's shoulders tensed, breath hissing through clenched teeth. "Easy," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if the word was meant for the dog or himself. The snap of a branch broke the quiet, loud and sudden enough to send Ethan's heart stuttering against his ribs. Shadow lunged before he could react, breaking into a limping sprint towards the noise, snarl echoing through the pines. "Shadow!" Ethan barked, but the dog didn't falter, eyes fixed on something Ethan couldn't see, something that moved too quick, too silent, deeper into the dark. Swearing under his breath, Ethan took off after him, boots slipping over ice-slick roots, hands clenched white around his gun. Claire's voice called his name, high and tight with panic, but he didn't slow, eyes locked on the flash of dark fur weaving through trees. Branches lashed at his face, stinging his cheeks, breath burning in his lungs with every step. The world narrowed to snow and shadow, to the steady thud of paws over ice and the growls that threaded through the wind, low and furious. Shadow skidded to a halt at the edge of a clearing, legs quivering beneath him, ears pinned flat. Ethan stumbled to a stop beside him, breath catching, ragged and raw, and the gun felt heavy and useless in his hand as he followed the dog's gaze to the ground. Blood stained the snow in dark smears, leading to a mass of fur and antlers sprawled in the center of the clearing, throat torn and eyes dull. But it wasn't the deer that set Ethan's pulse hammering, that dried the breath in his throat to dust. It was the tracks. Not wolf, not bear. Too long, too narrow, claws splayed like fingers, fresh, half-buried beneath snow but unmistakable, weaving in tight circles around the carcass before vanishing into the pines. Ethan's stomach turned, ice coiling tight and cold in his gut. Shadow's ears twitched, a whine threading through his growl, and Ethan forced himself to move, to kneel by the prints, fingers skimming the edges with light, shaking touches. Too deep, too clean, no drag marks. Whatever made them was fast, efficient, and hunting. Claire stumbled into the clearing, breath heaving, eyes wide as they darted between Ethan, Shadow, and the blood staining the snow. "What the hell?" she started, voice cracking, but the words died quick as her gaze fixed on the tracks, color draining from her face. "That's... no, that's not possible," she whispered, backing a step, camera dropping limp in her hands. Ethan forced his voice steady, even as his fingers trembled against the grip of his gun. "It's real enough," he bit out. Claire's eyes snapped to his, wild and accusing. "Then what the hell is it?" Ethan's tongue felt heavy, words sticking sharp in his throat, but Shadow growled, a low rumble that sent every nerve sparking to life. Branches shivered, snow sloughing off in pale flurries, and the air buzzed with something bitter, metallic. Instinct screamed, too loud to ignore. "Move!" Ethan snapped, grabbing Claire's arm, hauling her back into the trees as Shadow's snarl split the air, ears pinned and eyes fixed on the shadows threading through pines. "Go! Go!" They stumbled through the snow, breath harsh and burning, branches clawing at jackets and hair, the whisper of leaves rising to a howl that rattled through bone. Shadow limped at Ethan's side, teeth bared and hackles raised, but never faltered, every step a barrier between them and whatever hunted the dark. Snow thickened, blurring the world to white and gray, and Ethan's eyes burned with the cold, with the effort of keeping them fixed forward, not daring to look back, not daring to breathe. The cabin door slammed behind them with a shudder that rattled the walls, and Ethan's knees hit wood hard, lungs heaving for air that wouldn't come. Claire sank beside him, eyes wide and glazed, fingers white where they gripped his sleeve. Outside, the wind screamed, fierce and raw, rattling window panes and slipping through cracks with whispers too close to words. Shadow slumped against Ethan's side, fur matted and trembling, breath harsh but steady. Ethan buried his hands in the dog's scruff, grounding himself in the warmth, the heartbeat fluttering fast beneath his palms. His eyes drifted to the window, to the darkness pressing close, and his breath hitched, pulse thundering loud enough to drown out thought. Gold eyes glinted from the tree line, unblinking, wild, and Ethan's blood ran cold. The wind howled, rattling the cabin walls, slipping cold fingers through every crack and seam. Ethan braced a shoulder against the door, breath raw in his throat, ears straining for any sound beyond the storm's fury. Shadow pressed close at his side, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling steady from deep in his chest. Claire slumped against the wall, face bloodless, eyes fixed on the window where darkness pooled thick and heavy, hiding what watched from the tree line. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, hands shaking around the hunting knife she'd pulled from her pack, knuckles white with the force of her grip. Outside, snow lashed in curtains, but through the gusts and groans of pine, Ethan swore he heard it, that whispering, threading through the wind, words too soft to catch but too deliberate to ignore. His pulse thundered, a drumbeat in his ears, sweat prickling cold at the nape of his neck despite the fire's heat. They'd barely made it back, stumbling through snowdrifts chest deep, lungs burning with each breath, every shadow a threat. Shadow had limped the last stretch, muzzle flecked with frost, blood staining the bandage on his leg dark and wet. But the dog hadn't slowed, hadn't faltered, eyes fixed on the path behind them, ears pinned flat. Ethan's hands trembled where they pressed to Shadow's fur, grounding himself in the warmth and the heartbeat that thudded fast beneath his palms. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the memories back. The clearing, the tracks clawed deep into the snow, the eyes glinting gold from the shadows. "We need to move," Claire rasped, voice shaking, eyes darting between the door and the window. "That thing, whatever the hell it is, it's hunting us." Ethan's jaw clenched, the tang of blood sharp on his tongue. "We move, we die," he bit out, harsher than intended, but fear sharpened every word. "Best chance is to hold out till morning." Claire's lips parted in protest, but another gust rattled the cabin, and the lights flickered, plunging them into a heartbeat of darkness before the bulbs flared, weak and sputtering. Shadow growled, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the window, and Ethan's breath stuttered, heart hammering against his ribs. They were running out of time. Ethan's fingers curled tighter in Shadow's fur, and the dog leaned into the touch, a huff of breath misting white between bared teeth. The radio crackled to life, static bleeding through silence with a hiss that set every nerve raw and sparking. Ethan's head snapped up, eyes narrowing as the distortion broke, a voice threading through, warped and distant. "Carter, do you copy?" The breath left Ethan's lungs in a rush, relief heady and dizzying. He lunged for the receiver, twisting the dial until the static cleared, and the sheriff's voice came through, tinny but blessedly familiar. "Jesus, Carter, where the hell are you? We've got reports of shots fired near the old reserve. Over." Ethan's fingers slipped on the receiver, hands slick with cold sweat, words catching sharp in his throat. "Cabin off Route 9, he ground out, forcing the tremor from his voice. "We've got wounded. Something's out there, bigger than wolves." A pause, static crackling, sharp and jagged. "Hunker down," the sheriff barked. "Help's en route. 20 minutes, maybe less." The line went dead, plunging the cabin into silence once more. 20 minutes. Ethan swallowed hard, dragging a hand over his face, pulse a drumbeat at his temples. They'd never make it. Shadow's ears perked, eyes flicking to the window, growl deepening to a snarl that bared teeth too white against dark fur. Claire edged closer, knife held in a white-knuckled grip, eyes glassy and wild. Then the window shattered, glass spraying in glittering shards as the wind screamed through the cabin, carrying snow and the scent of pine and blood, raw and coppery. Ethan's arm flew up instinctively, shielding his face as shadows writhed at the edges of vision. Dark and hulking, eyes glinting gold in the storm's fury. Shadow lunged, snarl splitting the air, and Ethan's hand moved without thought, gun snapping up, muzzle flaring with light and thunder. The first shot caught the creature broadside, a howl splintering the night, raw and animal and furious. Claws raked through wood with a sound like tearing metal, and Claire screamed, knife flashing silver before teeth closed over her wrist, dragging her to the floor. Ethan swore, lungs seizing, feet skidding on frost-slick wood as he pivoted, firing blind into shadows that seemed to shift and blur with each breath. Blood spattered hot and dark, and the thing recoiled with a snarl that rattled through bone, retreating into the storm in a blur of fur and eyes and claws. Claire sobbed, cradling her wrist, blood seeping between her fingers in thick, sluggish rivulets. Shadow limped forward, growling low, teeth bared, but the eyes were gone, swallowed by the dark. Ethan's breath sawed in and out, chest burning, gun shaking in numb fingers, ears ringing with the echo of the shot. But the wind still screamed, and the whispers didn't fade, slipping through the cracks with words that seared ice down his spine. A howl split the night, closer now, threaded with fury and grief, and Ethan's stomach lurched, throat tight with dread. Not wolves, not bears. Guardians, old as the forest, older than memory, bound to the wild and the dark, and the balance that kept the peace. The words of the old ranger echoed, low and rasping, protectors of the border, keepers of the balance. His hands trembled, breath catching, eyes darting to shadow, to the amber eyes glinting gold in the fire's glow. The blood drained cold from his face, pulse a drumbeat in his ears. Shadow watched him, eyes too bright, too knowing, hackles raised, lips peeled back in a snarl that spoke of more than pain or fear. The whispers built, a crescendo threaded through the storm, and in the shadows eyes blinked to life, gold and furious and unblinking. Ethan's fingers clenched, teeth gritting against the roar in his skull, the memories that surged and twisted with each breath, of pines and blood, and eyes that glinted gold, accusing and wild. Shadow growled, low and steady, and Ethan's jaw tightened, the choice cold and final in his bones. He moved to the door, hands settling firm on the latch, gun cocked and breath steady. Shadow pressed to his side, eyes fixed on the dark, tail stiff and ears pinned. "If we die," Ethan rasped, voice hoarse, gaze hard. "We do it protecting our own." The door swung wide, wind howling through, and they plunged into the storm, hunter and hunted, guardian and kin, eyes gold and wild and furious, breath misting white against the dark.